Thank you all very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I'd like to start off with a question. So has anybody ever you ever had this feeling that the bad guys have an advantage over us good guys and gals? Anybody ever feel that way? Maybe once or twice? Well, I had that feeling. I've had that feeling many, many times, but there's one moment in time in particular where I had that feeling. And this is a story which usually takes me about an hour to tell. We don't have that kind of time, so I'll condense it by saying that about a decade ago, I was an incident responder. I was working a case where we caught a bad guy breaking into our network, and we began collecting as much evidence as we could. We had some sort of commercial network security appliances at the time which collected some types of data, but it wasn't the full picture, it wasn't consistent, there were a bunch of gaps in our visibility. And so we did the best we could with the data that we had, and we collected all the evidence, we gave it to the FBI, they began working through their process. And long story short, this hacker was actually terminally ill and actually ended up passing away before the FBI could go and knock on his door and take him in for questioning. And part of the reason for that was that we had gaps in our visibility, right? We didn't have really the kinds of telemetry that we needed on our network to, number one, detect this attack as early as possible, to, number two, really be able to tell the complete story of what happened from start to finish. So I had a problem, and I really felt, to further the point, as I was looking through this investigation, one of the things I noticed was he was using Backtrack Linux, which is now called Kali Linux, right? So he had this easy-to-use ISO image that had all of these attacker tools already compiled, already configured, ready to go at a minute's notice. And the problem that I saw back in 2008 was that we as defenders, we really didn't have anything like that. Right? I saw this issue where folks were struggling to compile this tool and configure this tool and get them talking together and get them integrated to form a cohesive picture of what's going on in their enterprises. And so that really started this little thing that we call Security Onion. And it's a free and open source project used to peel back the layers of your network and make your adversaries cry. Right? You see what I did there? So it's a free and open source platform. It's used for intrusion detection, network security monitoring, threat hunting, these kinds of things that we do as defenders to monitor our networks, to get the telemetry, collect all the information about what's going on, not only on the network, but on the endpoints themselves. As we see, more and more of our network traffic is encrypted, it becomes that much more important to be collecting information from our endpoints as well. And so, that's kind of the good thing and the bad thing of network encryption. We all say as security practitioners that, yes, we want encryption. It's a good thing for privacy. We all want privacy. But at the same time, as network defenders, it makes our job a little bit more difficult. And so, therefore, we have to sort of realize that that's a little bit of a blind spot when it comes to network visibility. And we want to kind of fill in the gaps there with some additional telemetry from our endpoints as well. So Security Onion is a flexible platform. You can download our ISO image, just like I said before, that this attacker was using Backtrack Linux, which is now called Kali Linux, an easy-to-use ISO image for red teaming, pen testing, and actual attacks. Security Onion is kind of the same thing for the flip side. It's an easy-to-use ISO image. You can go and download it today. That ISO image has been downloaded over 750,000 times, being used all around the world for teaching, for learning, but more importantly for real-world incident response. Folks are catching bad guys every single day using Security Onion. Now, if you don't want to use our ISO image, you can take Ubuntu 16.04. You can add our PPA and install our packages on top of it that way as well. Now, while we're talking about the platform itself, architecturally, I want to go ahead and kind of talk about our new platform that we started building last year. And so kind of one of the biggest pieces of feedback that we get is that, a lot of folks really, really like Ubuntu. It's a great Linux distribution, but a lot of folks really, really like Red Hat and CentOS. So we want to be able to support that. And so one of the things that we started doing a couple of years ago is we started introducing the Elastic Stack into our platform. We started using Docker images as a deployment mechanism versus traditional Linux packages. So instead of Ubuntu Debian packages, we actually distribute our Elastic Stack via Docker images. And that began this really journey for us into what is this world of Dockers and what are the advantages that we can get out of it. And so really that's now going to allow us to support in this new platform that we're calling Hybrid Hunter the ability to run not only on Ubuntu but also on Red Hat, CentOS, just about anywhere else you can run Docker because it's a much more universal packaging format. So we're really excited about that. That's currently in testing. You can go and play with that today as well if you're interested in Docker or if you're interested in Red Hat CentOS support. We'd love to get your feedback on that platform. And we hope to be able to make some sort of a release later this year. But you can play with it today. Now, for the rest of this talk, I'm going to be talking about our more traditional Ubuntu-based platform. But I did want to put that kind of thought for the future out there in terms of where we're going as a platform. So what do we actually have? What do we actually build into Security Onion to give you that kind of visibility that you're looking for? Well, we start with the best-of-breed open source tools for network security monitoring. So the first thing you want is really some sort of process that's going to look at your network traffic, match it against some sort of rule set, and generate alerts. So we're looking for IDS alerts. So the best-of-breed open source tools are Snort and Suricata. Both of them have been around for a long time. We support both. We view them as interchangeable parts, so you can pick which one works best for you. Now, IDS alerts are great. Many times they will start an investigation, but anybody who's ever manned an IDS console can tell you that IDS alerts usually don't answer the questions that they prompt. So they start a question, but then it's kind of up to you as the analyst to answer that question. So that's where kind of the rest of this comes into play. So we really want some contextual data around those IDS alerts so that we can paint a really complete picture of what actually happened. So for example, to get back to the story that I told at the beginning, we had an attacker breaking into our network. He generated some IDS alerts, but then it was kind of up to us to try to fill in the gaps between this IDS alert and this IDS alert and this IDS alert. What actually transpired between those, and more importantly, after the fact. Once he got in, what did he do from there? So this protocol metadata is going to come from Bro. It's now called Zeek, and that's going to give you lots and lots of very rich, detailed protocol logging for your network. It's going to log every single network connection it sees, all the DNS traffic, all the HTTP transactions, SSL certificates. So this very detailed logging of everything that we see happening on your network. Now, if that wasn't enough, we go the next step and we give you kind of a video camera for your network. So full packet capture recorded by NetSniffNG. And so that way, if you have an incident, you can then rewind the videotape and kind of reconstruct the scene of the crime. So that's kind of the pieces of the network puzzles so that you can take Security Onion, running these components, connect it to a TAP or a span port, and you can instantly be generating IDS alerts, which kind of prompt your investigations. And then you can sort of follow up on those investigations using the protocol metadata and the full packet capture. Now, in the previous slide, we kind of talked about some of the logs that we generate, things like IDS alerts, Bro logs, things like that. So we need a place to store those logs and to be able to slice and dice those logs and do some threat hunting. So the Elastic Stack is really a great way to do that. So we're talking about Elasticsearch, Logstash, and Kibana. So we take all these logs, We send them into Logstash. It does some parsing, some normalization. It stores them into Elasticsearch. And then we use Kibana as a web interface to visualize that data and start running some queries, doing some hunting for those bad guys who might be hiding out on our networks. Now, as I mentioned before, network visibility is great, but as more and more of our network traffic is encrypted, that becomes less and less valuable to us as defenders, and it becomes more and more important for us to start collecting data directly from our endpoints to get some more visibility into what's going on in the health of our network. So we really try to integrate with the best-of-breed open source tools for endpoint telemetry. So Wazoo is kind of the next generation fork of an older tool called OSEC, been around for a long time. And it's a great host-based intrusion detection system. So you can deploy this cross-platform agent on your endpoints. It will then be collecting logs, analyzing those logs. It also does rootkit detection and file integrity checking. And all of that for the low, low price of $0, right? It's a great endpoint agent, gives you lots of really good visibility. Another endpoint agent that we integrate with is Beats. That comes from the Elastic family. So you can install WinLog Beats or any of the other Beats, and you can have them send their data to that back-end Elasticsearch instance that we have running in Security Onion. And we can parse that data and visualize it and slice it and dice it. Now, when we're talking about Windows endpoints in particular, Microsoft has a really great tool written by Mark Russinovich and his team at sysinternals called Sysmon. Sysmon generates some really, really comprehensive logs for Windows endpoints, things like process creation, things like network connection logging, and that's really valuable data that we really need to be collecting off of our endpoints if we can. And so what we've done is we've created the parsing, we've created the visualizations in our back end so that you can deploy Sysmon to your environment and then start collecting those Sysmon logs and start hunting through those to, again, find those adversaries hiding out in your environment. Now, another great tool that Mark Russinovich and his team wrote is called AutoRuns. AutoRuns is all about exposing those persistence mechanisms that may exist on a Windows endpoint. And so, as we all know, attackers, if they can get you to run their code on your machine once, that's great, but they really want to establish persistence so that when you reboot your computer, that process is kicked off yet again. So AutoRuns is a great technology for looking at all of those different places that an attacker can hook into your Windows operating system to establish that persistence mechanism. So we can deploy AutoRuns. It will then start generating all of the visibility into those persistence mechanisms. We then collect that and visualize that for you in Kibana. Finally, in terms of endpoint telemetry, there's another great project called OS Query. It's another great cross-platform endpoint agent, which gives you lots and lots of abilities in terms of querying those endpoints and getting lots of valuable intel out of them. So we've done a lot of work with integrating with that as well. So really and truly, you know, we try not to sort of mandate or dictate that thou shalt use this particular endpoint agent technology or solution. We try to integrate with as many as we can and really kind of meet folks where they're at in terms of, okay, if you want to use Wazoo, that's fine. If you want to use Beats, that's fine as well. Here's just a very quick screenshot of some Sysmon logs that came in showing you some suspicious processes running on your Windows boxes. And then this, kind of hard to see based on the projector, but this is one of our Sysmon dashboards that we build into Kibana so that you can kind of slice and dice that information coming from those Sysmon logs. So that's a brief introduction to kind of what we do in the Security Onion project from a network visibility standpoint, from an endpoint visibility standpoint. Now let's kind of talk about some use cases because you may be hearing about Security Onion for the first time today, so you might want to go and download it and play with it. So the easiest way to play with it is kind of in this use case of a small forensics VM. Right? So you could fire up a virtual machine, you can install our ISO image in about 10 minutes, and you can run this new utility that we have called SO import PCAP. So that's going to take a PCAP file, and we have a bunch of samples of malware built into /opt/samples. So if you download our ISO image, you've got really everything you need to actually play with some real malware traffic and see what it looks like. So you can run so import pcap, and it's going to take that pcap file right out of our samples directory. Or if you have your own pcap files that you want to provide to it as well, you can do that. So run so import pcap, and it's going to run it through Snort or Suricata, generate those IDS alerts that we talked about. It's going to run it through Bro and generate all those protocol metadata logs that we talked about. And then you're going to be able to go into our web-based interfaces to slice and dice that data, looking at your IDS alerts, and kind of getting a feel for what we provide to you right out of the box in Security Onion. So that's kind of the first use case, and I'll actually demo that in a few minutes. The next use case, if you get your feet wet with this so import pcap process, you might say, hey, I really want to deploy this on my network. So you might stand up kind of a standalone deployment to begin with. So you might take a standard server-based machine, install our ISO image, or install Ubuntu. As we said before, you can do it either way. And then get up and running in a small standalone capacity there, connected to a TAP or a SPAN port to collect your network traffic, then start deploying some endpoint agents and collecting logs from those. So that's kind of your very first production deployment would be standalone. But then you might get into a situation where, hey, I've got this ginormous enterprise network. I've got lots and lots of network enclaves and subnets and DMZs and different areas that I'd like to monitor. So at that point, you might want to build a real distributed deployment. And we fully support that. We've got several different deployment strategies depending on your network architecture and how you want to actually deploy Security Onion. So we do have a master server architecture. So you'll have a master server that you build first. Then you have your sensors that are going to be monitoring your network traffic. Then you might have on the back end some storage nodes. And so we really try to build this to be as scalable as possible. So you can start, again, with kind of a standalone deployment, but then ultimately start snapping in new sensors, start snapping in new storage nodes on the back end to kind of scale your Elasticsearch back end and be able to support more and more logs. All right, so before we get into the case study, I'd like to pause. I've been talking for a few minutes. So any questions or comments about anything I've covered so far? Yes, sir. You mentioned that it needs to be a server class to run this thing? So the question is, does it need to be a server class? For most real-world enterprise deployments, you would want to deploy on a server-class machine. We do have folks, of course, that run on a standard desktop PC that they've recycled. It all depends on how much network traffic you're going to be monitoring and how much horsepower that actually requires. So, if you're talking about doing this on a home network, you could absolutely run on a small form factor PC with 8 gigabytes of RAM, and it would do a great job. If you're talking about monitoring a gigabit per second or higher, you're not going to be able to do that on a small form factor PC. You would want a big server class machine, lots of RAM, lots of disk space, because we're doing full packet capture. And you want server class NICs, network adapters, if you're running at that kind of bandwidth. Are you familiar with anyone using a Raspberry distribution of this? Any of the other really tiny ones? You're talking about the Raspberry Pi? So the Raspberry Pi is great. I love my Raspberry Pi. However, those machines are so underpowered for the job that we do. You really wouldn't be able to do anything meaningful with them. So we compile all of our packages for 64-bit Intel architectures. So we don't support ARM architectures at this time. However, when you ask about Raspberry Pi, there is a brand new called Atomic Pi, which is very similar in form factor to the Raspberry Pi, but it's Intel-based. And it's a little bit more powerful than the Raspberry Pi. I'm still not expecting that you can monitor lots and lots of network traffic with it, but basically the same price, and it's Intel architecture, and it's a little bit more powerful. So you might want to check that out. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Have you thought about a roadmap for API integration?
Yes. The question is, have we thought about a roadmap for API integration? We get lots of requests for API integration. I caught your talk earlier today. It was a great talk. And API is definitely one of the things that we want to be able to integrate with as many different systems and automate things as much as possible. So we absolutely have that on our roadmap. I can't give you any promised target dates, but yes, we want to get there, absolutely. Yes, ma'am.
If you have snort answer how to deploy, how does it determine which program to use?
So the question is, if you have snort and suricata deployed, how does it determine which one to use? The answer to that is that when you run through our setup wizard, we actually ask you the question, which of these would you like to use? Now, if you start off with Security Onion and you run in evaluation mode, it's going to automatically choose snort for you. But if you run in production mode, it will ask you the question, hey, do you want to run snort or suricata? And then when it comes to, like, if you're doing a big distributed deployment with a master server and multiple sensors, you essentially answer that question once for your master server, and then all of your other boxes kind of inherit that setting from the master server. Any other questions or comments so far?
Updating those servers, when it comes to an update, do you have a mechanism for that?
Very good question. So is there a mechanism for updating? You know, as security practitioners, we preach that thou shalt update your systems, right? So it's very important for us to practice what we preach. And so we definitely view that as something that's very important for our Security Onion community. We have a dedicated tool that makes updates as streamlined as possible. We call it SOUP, Security Onion Updates. And so all you have to do is run SOUP, and it's going to install all the updates for you and take care of everything that you need to worry about. As a matter of fact, for distributed deployments, you know, let's say that you're running 100 sensors. You don't want to have to log into sensor number 1 and run SOUP, and sensor number 2 and sensor number 3 individually. So we actually have a mechanism where you can run SOUP on your entire deployment at once because we've integrated the Salt Stack, which is kind of similar to Puppet, Chef, or Ansible. It's an orchestration technology which then allows us to push updates to our entire sensor grid at once. Right? So rather than having to have an entire team of sysadmins run these boxes, let's figure out how to automate the stuff and do as many things from an automated fashion as we can. Yes, sir? So the question is about Ubuntu 16.04, which is still fully supported, right? It's a long-term support release. And we do have plans to move to the next major version. I mentioned previously our new Hybrid Hunter platform, which is more Docker-based. And so when that release comes out, we will be on kind of the next major versions of both Ubuntu and Red Hat and CentOS. So, for example, I think Red Hat 8 just came out. And so CentOS 8 will be not too far behind it. And so our new Hybrid Hunter platform will be on the latest and greatest versions of those respective Linux distributions. Any other questions or comments so far? All right, well, how about a demo? All right, so this projector is a little bit suboptimal. So you might have to squint a little bit. You might have to move up close a little bit. I'll try to zoom into the screen as much as possible to make this go as smoothly as possible. But if you can't see all the details, just use your imagination. I'll talk you through it, and we'll work together as a security operations center, and we'll kick this bad guy out of our network. So here's our scenario. We've got a bad guy. He's targeted our enterprise. He wants to get in, so what does he do? Spear phishing email, right? Works every time. It's been very popular for many, many years because everybody's going to click the link. Chances are he's going to get in and use that initial foothold to then do some lateral movement, pillage the village, and ultimately exfiltrate the data. So let's see what this actually looks like from a network visibility perspective. So here we've got Kibana. This is our web interface that's included in the Elastic Stack, and this is going to show us all of our IDS alerts, all of our bro logs, and all of our other logs as well. So I mentioned before that IDS alerts really kind of start many investigations, and I'll kind of zoom in here to our IDS alert panel, And we see there are 4 different IDS alerts. Is there any one that kind of jumps out at you as most interesting? I heard executable. So, for example, this one down here is pretty interesting because it's not only an executable, but it's also .doc.exe, right? Why would an attacker send maybe an email attachment or a link to a document that's called .doc.exe? Modern versions of Windows will hide the file extension by default, right? So let's envision this spear phishing email, okay? This is your payroll department. Download this Word document and fill it out for the new payroll system. Right? Everybody wants to get paid, so I'm going to click the link. I'm going to download this Word document. I'm going to open up Windows Explorer, and it's going to hide that extension. And I'm going to see .doc, and I'm going to say, yep, that's a Word document. I need to open that bad boy up so I can get my paycheck, right? So that's interesting. So now if I want to get more information about that particular IDS alert, I can filter down into that. And remember before I said that IDS alerts begin investigations, but very often to complete those investigations, I need to kind of fill in the gaps using bro logs or full packet capture. In this case, let me go ahead and pivot to full packet capture, which is going to be like the videotape, rewinding the videotape so we can reconstruct the scene of the crime. Now in this case, we can actually see there's an HTTP GET request. All right, so this is the user clicking on that link in the spear phishing email. And what we may have seen in years past from sort of traditional network security appliances, IDS appliances, they might fire that IDS alert that we just looked at. They might give you some of this data, but it might just be sort of the GET request itself. It might include a little bit of the server's response, but maybe not the whole thing. But in this case, because we have full packet capture, we can actually see that entire TCP stream from start to finish. So here we see the MZ file header. And then we can start looking through that Windows exe. And then we can start to see interesting artifacts in that exe like this. You might tell me what that might be indicative of. Okay, potentially calling back to a command and control server. Unsecured because it's HTTP, okay. Now there's something very interesting in this, and that's really the first word there, which is connect. And that's a very special HTTP verb or method, which is specifically used for connecting through proxy servers, right? So this is actually indicative. If this is malware, this is proxy-aware malware, okay? I've heard some folks say over the years, well, you know, we've got a proxy server on our network, so we don't have to worry about malware. Well, modern malware is proxy-aware, and that's an example of it. So let's continue on our journey here, and let's see if we can see anything else interesting. So as I zoom in, you see any interesting artifacts? Okay, so I hear this. What is this? It's a registry key. Specifically, it's a persistence mechanism, right? We talked about that before. An attacker wants to run code on your computer, but he also wants to establish persistence so that when you reboot, that code runs again, and the Windows run key in the registry is a great way of doing that. So not only do we have proxy-aware malware, but we also have a persistence mechanism. All right, so is there anything else interesting that jumps out at you? Very good. We have a hard-coded IP address. So whenever I'm working an incident like this and I see that there's a user downloading an exe, a potentially malicious exe, I'm going to ask myself some questions. Number one, did they actually download the exe? Well, we're seeing by the full packet capture here that yes, indeed, they did download it. The server responded with a 200 OK, meaning I've got that file. Here it is in its entirety. So they did download it. The second question I'm going to ask is, did they actually execute that exe? Now, based on what we're seeing here, is there a way that we can test to see if the user executed this particular exe? Right. So our assumption here is that if this exe has a hard-coded IP address in it, then when this exe is run, that machine is going to beacon out to this IP address. So if our theory is in fact true and the user executed the exe, we would then expect to see some additional connections after this download to that IP address. Right? And this is really kind of another good illustration of why IDS alerts alone are not enough. Because if we were to look at just our IDS alerts, we would see this initial download, but we're not even going to have any IDS alerts for the connection back to this 221 IP address. So that's why it's critically important to collect not just IDS alerts, but also protocol logs and full packet capture as well. All right, so definitely some interesting things to be found there. And because this is full packet capture, we could, if we wanted to, download this PCAP. We could open it up in Wireshark. We could actually extract this exe out. We could throw it into a Cuckoo sandbox or some other kind of malware analysis tool. We could do some reverse engineering on it if we wanted to. And that's really the beauty of full packet capture on your network. So that's really kind of the first step in this investigative process for this particular incident. So now let's go back, because we found this hard-coded IP address. So now my next question is, did the user execute the exe? Was there follow-up activity to that 221 IP address? So if I look at my bro connections, I can filter here and then go down to the bottom, and this is going to show me all of the connections. So do we see a connection to that suspect IP address? Absolutely. Do we see just one connection to that IP? So we actually have this connection to 221 up here, and we have another connection to that 221 down here. In this case, the victim that we looked at in the previous TCP stream was .20, but this machine up here is .10. So just by doing a little bit of pivoting, we've actually found another machine that might be included in the scope of this particular incident. Right? Again, there were no IDS alerts for this .10 machine. We only had IDS alerts for the .20. But by logging all the connections on our network, by doing a little bit of pivoting, we get more intelligence about this particular incident. So let's go ahead and pull the string on this particular TCP stream. So we'll pivot to our full packet capture. All right, so can anybody make any sense of this? Let's first of all start with the destination port. Okay, so I hear SSL. It's kind of a trick question. All right, so if this were SSL, if this were HTTPS, what would we expect to see right about here? The first thing you would see in HTTPS is the exchange of the certificate, right? The certificate's got to be exchanged in clear text before the encryption can begin. Now, we don't actually see that here. It is a little bit hard to see. But when you look at this, the encryption begins immediately. So this is not actually true SSL. This is not actually true HTTPS. And as it turns out, if we were to look at that malware that we looked at in the previous TCP stream and do some more kind of reverse engineering on it, we determined that that's Poison Ivy remote access Trojan. Poison Ivy's been around for a long, long time, but yet it's still in use today. Why? Because it still works, and it still works quite well. Attackers are very successful with it. Now, as it turns out, Poison Ivy has its own command and control channel, and it has its own encryption mechanism. And that, of course, can run on any port it wants to. Many attackers will run it on port 443 simply because that's allowed outbound on most firewalls, so it has the greatest chance of getting through. And let's face it, most defenders are just going to say, well, that's HTTPS, we'll just move on. So in this case, this is actually the command and control beacon from this malware-infected machine. And so what can an attacker do with this Poison Ivy remote access Trojan? turn on the webcam, turn on the microphone, turn on a keylogger, transfer files. They can do anything they want to, right? So if we were to look at this, because it is encrypted, we're not going to be able to make much sense out of it. We can kind of scroll and we can kind of look at, we've color-coded this so that source is highlighted in blue and destination is highlighted in red. So you might be able to kind of fall back to some old-school signals intelligence and just kind of make some inferences as to what's going on here. We saw a good amount of traffic here highlighted in red, which kind of seems like it might be an initial download, and then you get into this sort of back and forth, right? If you were to squint your eyes a little bit and sort of make some guesses as to what's going on here, any ideas what that might be? What I'm envisioning in my head is something like this, where, bad guy is sitting in his evil lair, his parents' basement, let's say, right? And he gets a green light that this new poison ivy remote access Trojan has now connected to his command and control server. Ding! I did that on purpose. And so he gets this green light, and so now he says, they clicked on the link, they've taken the bait, and so now I can issue some commands to this Windows machine. So he might type in dir and get a directory listing. He might then start looking through their file system. He might then start connecting to other machines on the network. But what we get the sense for here is that this is kind of an interactive shell session, a cmd.exe, a command prompt, where an attacker is issuing commands and getting some results back. We don't know that for sure, but we're kind of making an inference here. So at this point, what do we know? We know that user, they got a spear phishing email, they clicked the link, they downloaded the exe, they executed the exe, it did that initial outbound connection to the attacker's command and control server, and it looks like he's issuing commands to that machine now. So now the question is, what now? Again, we've long since left our IDS alerts. They really only alerted us on the very beginning of this investigation, but we've still got a long way to go in order to reconstruct the scene of this crime. So let's kind of widen our search. Let's cast a wider net, and, well, we could remove this search and we could look kind of more broadly at our different data types. I mentioned before that we use BRO to capture all this protocol metadata for our networks. And we've looked at the BRO connections. That's what we just looked at previously. And we knew about this HTTP down here because that was the initial download of the EXE. But we also see some FTP traffic. Now that's kind of interesting, because hopefully on your networks you probably don't see too much FTP traffic nowadays. And so maybe we might drill into that and figure out what's going on there. So now if I were to scroll down here and again click the link to pivot to full packet capture, I see some good old clear text FTP traffic. Again, as security practitioners, we tell folks, hey, use secure protocols. Don't use FTP because it's clear text. And we hope that most of our users have gotten that message and they're doing the right thing. But when it comes to working cases like this, attackers still like to use FTP because quite often it's allowed outbound on the firewall, and it's easy to use, and it just works. And let's face it, most defenders aren't really looking at their traffic that closely, and they're just sailing right through there. So based on that, we can actually fully reconstruct the scene of this crime and see that the attacker has now caused this compromised Windows PC to then connect to his FTP server and log in with his username of Jack and his password of too awesome. All right, I like this guy. And then he uses the FTP store command to upload two files. One of them is called 1.txt, and the other is called 2.txt. Now, we don't actually see those files here because of the way that FTP works. Of course, FTP is a very old protocol. It has a separate command channel and a separate data channel. So to actually see those files in their entirety, we actually want to go and look at those FTP data channels. And for that, I'll actually go back to my BRO connections. And we could look for a connection service of FTP data. But in this case, it's simple enough just to look for a port of 20. And let's just start with this one here. Actually, let's start with this one. All right. Here's our first file that was transferred to the attacker's FTP server. What do you see here? What can you tell me about this? Well, I hear hashes. All right, so. Okay, so gsec dump, which you can see at the very top of that window, is a utility used to dump Windows password hashes. An attacker might use that so that he can get my password hashes and take them offline to a password cracker like John the Ripper, and then crack my password. So now if he's got my password, he can be me. Alternatively, he could simply use those hashes in a pass-the-hash attack and just be me directly. Now, the next question is, okay, we see gsec dump. Do we actually see password hashes? Because this transcript ends right here. So do we see any password hashes? No. What do we see instead? Well, the help screen, absolutely. So here's what I'm envisioning happened. Remember, the attacker had this Poison Ivy remote access Trojan command and control channel with an interactive command prompt to this victim machine. I'm envisioning that he did something like this: gsec dump -a redirect into one.txt. That's what he wanted to do. But maybe he was in a hurry, and maybe he fat-fingered it. Maybe he hit the A key twice. And so gsec dump comes back and says, you're an idiot. There is no AA option. Here are the correct options. And so that's what he got. Instead of exfiltrating the actual password hashes, he actually got the help output. You know, it's kind of fun when you can actually catch attackers screwing up, because they're human just like we are. They make mistakes just like we do. So, you know, it's fun to be able to laugh at them every now and then. Potentially. So that's where our investigation needs to go next, right? To that other file that was uploaded, because clearly this one was not that great. So I already had this one pulled up over here. So what does that look like to you? I hear zip. It's a RAR file. RAR file is like a zip file. It's a compressed archive. What's inside of that compressed archive? Can you tell? Do you see any table of contents, any file indexes, any file names, anything? No. It's encrypted. It's a password-protected RAR file, right? So the cool thing here is that because we're doing full packet capture, I mentioned before, we could have taken that exe that we saw in step 1. We could have extracted that and done some reverse engineering on it. We can do the same thing with this exfiltrated password-protected RAR file. We can download that PCAP. We can open it up in Wireshark. Maybe. And then what we can do is we can extract, and I'll save this as out.rar. So now I've got this file. And now we're trying to open this password-protected RAR file. Now, in the interest of time, I will tell you that this is a trivial password. We could probably guess this password if we tried human guesses for 10 or 20 minutes. Now, the other thing is, I mentioned earlier that an attacker, when he gets our password hashes, he might take them offline and do what with them? Might crack them using something like John the Ripper. As it turns out, we can do the same thing. If we had the time, we could actually take this password-protected RAR file, run it through John the Ripper, and we could break this password, and we'd be able to find out our password and be able to open the file. And there's all of our sensitive data. that is your Social Security numbers. That's your credit card numbers. That's your top secret, confidential, intellectual property that just walked out the door. And we were able to reconstruct the scene of that crime because we had not only IDS alerts, not only the protocol metadata, but also the full packet capture so that we could fully rewind the videotape and reconstruct the scene of the crime. Is that pretty cool? Did you like that? All right. I can't tell you that. You'll have to run John the Ripper yourself. Yes, sir.
Can't you get the password if you have full packet capture because you typed it in?
Well, he would have. That's a very good question, but he would have typed it in over the encrypted Poison Ivy command and control channel. So if we could decrypt that Poison Ivy traffic, we could potentially pull it from there. That's a good thought. All right, so now that you're ready to play with Security Onion, go to our website, securityonion.net. You can download our ISO image. You can install it in a virtual machine in about 10 minutes. And you can actually run SO import PCAP against the PCAP sample that we actually played with today. So you could actually do this entire exercise from the leisure of your own office environment. We do actually sell preloaded appliances, so you can find more information about that at securityonionsolutions.com. And if you're interested in training, we actually do have a training class coming up in Costa Mesa. That's going to be a 4-day class, June the 4th through June the 7th. We've got a really nice discount that we've put together just for you all here at the ISSA Summit. That discount code is Costa Mesa, and that gives you 15% off. But please notice that the registration deadline is Tuesday, May the 28th. So if you're interested, please go ahead and sign up for that class. And you can find more at our website, securityonionsolutions.com, and specifically at the on-site training link. Any questions or comments? Sometimes open source projects get a bad rep for having suboptimal documentation, but we've worked really, really hard to try to provide good comprehensive documentation. So thank you for that. Yes, sir? Why did Bro change its name to Zeek? That's a good question you'd have to ask the bros. Yes, sir. Support the cloud. Very good question. A member of our community a couple of years ago, Josh Brower, he put together a document, really an architecture called the Security Onion Cloud Client. And it's a way that you can take a cloud host and you can install essentially a virtual tap on that host, bring that network traffic over to a separate host for network analysis via Security Onion. And so that's been out there. That's been documented for several years now. That works. Several cloud vendors are getting really close to providing sort of a virtual tap. Azure just announced it just a couple of weeks ago. I'm hearing rumblings that AWS might not be too far behind. So from a network tapping perspective, we should have some really compelling solutions there pretty soon. And really and truly, you know, it kind of gets back to what we were saying earlier about network visibility become less and less effective over time. And so, you know, we're really focusing for the future on endpoint visibility. And that plays really, really well in the cloud. All right. Thank you all very much. I appreciate it. Have a great day.